The morning my daughter called to tell me she'd booked her flight home for Christmas, I was standing in the kitchen making oatmeal, the same way I've made it every morning for 40 years. Steel-cut oats, a little brown sugar, half a banana. I remember thinking, finally, because she and her husband hadn't come home in almost 2 years. I hung up the phone and smiled at the window. The yard looked bare and cold in the December light, but I felt warm. I was 63 years old, retired 18 months. My wife of 31 years, was upstairs, still sleeping. I didn't think to wake her to share the good news. That should have told me something, I suppose. When you stop wanting to share the small joys with someone, the marriage is already bleeding out. You just haven't noticed where the wound is yet. Her name was Patricia, mine is Howard. We'd built a life in Asheville, North Carolina, a 4-bedroom house we bought in 1998, 2 cars in the driveway, a daughter named Claire who lived in Denver with her husband, a man named Trevor, who I will get to shortly. For most of our marriage, things were fine. Not perfect, fine. Patricia and I argued about money, about Claire, about whether to repaint the guest room. Normal things. By the time I retired from my position as a civil engineer at a regional firm, I had a solid pension, a 401k, I'd been feeding since I was 28, and a joint savings account that carried just over $190,000. We also had the house, paid off in 2019. I tell you all of this not to brag, but because the money matters. In a story like mine, the money always matters. I noticed the first thing missing in February. I was looking for our homeowner's insurance documents. We'd had some wind damage to the back fence after an ice storm, and I went into the filing cabinet in the study, the one Patricia managed. She'd always handled the paperwork side of things. I handled the investments. She handled the filing. It was our system. The folder labeled Savings Joint was there, but when I opened it, the most recent statement was from 14 months prior. I assumed she'd just stopped printing them. Everything goes paperless now. So I logged into the bank's website. The balance was $31,400. I sat very still for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called the bank. The woman on the other end was polite. She walked me through the transaction history. Over the course of 16 months, $158,000 had been withdrawn in increments, sometimes $8,000, sometimes $12,500, once $22,000 in a single transfer. The transfers all went to an account I didn't recognize, a personal account, not joint, not mine. I asked if she could tell me whose account it was. She said she couldn't share that information. She was sorry. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in that chair in the study for a while longer, long enough for the furnace to click on and off twice, long enough for a truck to rumble past on the street outside. I kept thinking about the oatmeal I'd made that morning, how normal everything had looked. I didn't say anything to Patricia that night, or the next night. What I did instead was go to our local branch of the bank on a Tuesday morning when she had her book club. I brought every piece of identification I had. I asked them to print the last 2 years of transaction history on the joint account. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and read every line. The withdrawals had started in October of the year before. The first one was small, $3,200, the kind of amount that wouldn't raise a red flag if you weren't watching closely. Then they grew. Regular, deliberate, patient. Whoever was doing this, and I now had a very clear suspicion, was not panicking. They were planning. I drove home. Patricia was in the kitchen when I got back, chopping onions for soup. She asked how my morning was. I said fine. I asked how the book was. She told me the ending was disappointing. We ate dinner across from each other that night, and I watched her face and I thought 31 years. And I am looking at a stranger. I am a methodical man. I worked in engineering for 35 years. I do not make decisions without sufficient data. So instead of confronting her right then, I started gathering. I told Patricia I was going to spend a week in Knoxville visiting my college roommate, Vern. This was partially true. Vern did live in Knoxville, and I did call him, and he did agree to cover for me if she called. Vern is the kind of friend you make at 20 and keep for life. He didn't ask many questions. He just said, "Howard, whatever you need." What I actually did was check into a motel 40 minutes outside Asheville and hire a private investigator. Her name was Denise. She had an office above a dry cleaner's in Weaverville, 2 filing cabinets, a certificate on the wall, and the kind of flat expression that told you she'd heard everything and was surprised by nothing. I explained the situation. She quoted me a rate. I paid the first week in cash. I'd been withdrawing small amounts from my personal checking account for 3 weeks by then, quietly building a reserve. Denise called me 4 days later and asked me to come in. I sat across from her desk. She slid a manila folder across to me. Inside were photographs, printed on regular paper, nothing dramatic. Patricia leaving a restaurant in West Asheville with a man I recognized immediately, my son-in-law, Trevor, my daughter's husband. They were not eating lunch like family. There were more photographs, the 2 of them at a coffee shop, his hand on hers across the table. Patricia at a parking lot downtown, getting into his truck, a silver pickup, Colorado plates. My daughter's husband, the man who called me Howie at Thanksgiving and asked me to pass the cranberry sauce. Denise told me the account the money had been transferred to was in Trevor's name. She'd confirmed this through a contact she wouldn't name. She told me this wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this, a spouse and a family member working together. She said it with the flatness of someone who has long since stopped being shocked by what people are capable of. I thanked her. I folded the folder and put it in my jacket. I drove back to the motel and sat on the edge of the bed. My daughter was in Denver. She didn't know. I was almost certain she didn't know. Claire was 34 years old and had a good heart and worked as a school librarian. And the idea that she was part of this, I could not let myself go there. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I called Vern. He listened for a long time. Then he said, "Howard, you know what you have to do." I told him I wasn't sure I did. He said, "You do." He was right, but I needed to understand the scope of it first. I needed to know how much was gone, whether it was recoverable, and what I would be walking into legally if I confronted Patricia directly. So before I went home, before I said a single word, I made an appointment with a family law attorney in Biltmore Forest, a woman whose name I'd gotten from a colleague who'd gone to a divorce 5 years prior. Her name was Margaret, and she had silver hair and did not waste words. I laid out the situation. She listened. She asked several specific questions: dates, amounts, account types, whether the house was in both names. It was. Whether I had documentation. I did. Then she leaned back and told me, clearly and without softening it, that what Patricia had done likely constituted marital waste and potentially civil fraud. She said the transferred funds could potentially be recouped in divorce proceedings. She said the involvement of Trevor introduced complications but also additional legal exposure for him. She told me not to move any money, not to confront anyone, and not to say anything to my daughter until we had a clearer picture. "Do you understand?" she said. I told her I did. I drove home the following morning. I walked in through the garage. Patricia was at the kitchen table on her laptop. She looked up and said, "How was Vern?" "Good," I said. "Sends his regards." I put my bag down. I made coffee. I sat at the table across from her and looked at the woman I'd shared a bed with for 3 decades, and I thought about all the mornings we'd had coffee like this, and I felt something go cold and still inside me. Not rage, not grief, something quieter, the specific sadness of realizing the story you thought you were living was not the story at all. The hardest part of the next 6 weeks was not the evidence gathering. It was Christmas. Claire came home. Trevor came with her. They arrived on the 23rd, and I picked them up from the airport, and I shook Trevor's hand in the arrivals hall and looked him in the eye, and he smiled and said, "Hey, Howie, good to see you." He had a firm handshake. He was 41 years old, tan, broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that I now understood differently. He had been stealing from me for over a year. He knew exactly what he'd done, and he shook my hand and smiled. I smiled back. My daughter hugged me tight. She smelled like the same shampoo she'd used since college. She said, "Dad, I've missed you." And I held on a second longer than usual because I knew that what I was about to do, what I had to do, was going to change her life, and she didn't know it yet. Christmas Eve was quiet. We had lasagna, which has been our family tradition since before Claire was born, my mother's recipe. No one has ever explained why we eat Italian on Christmas Eve in a family from Tennessee. But there it is. We played cards. Patricia laughed at something Trevor said. They sat next to each other at the table. I watched. I said nothing. Christmas morning, Claire opened presents in the living room, cross-legged on the floor the way she'd done since she was 7 years old. Trevor gave her a necklace. She cried a little. It was a good necklace. I watched my son-in-law hold my daughter's face in his hands while she cried happy tears, and I had to look away. They left on the 27th. On January 9th, I filed for divorce. Margaret's office faxed the papers that morning. By noon, Patricia had been served. She was in the backyard when the process server knocked on the front door. I was at Vern's because Vern had driven down from Knoxville to be with me, which is the kind of thing Vern does. Patricia called me 18 times in 3 hours. I did not answer. She called Vern's cell. He answered. He told her I wasn't available, that I had legal representation, and that any communication should go through my attorney. Patricia apparently said several things that Vern later declined to repeat. He just shook his head and poured me another cup of coffee. What came next was ugly. The way divorce is always ugly. The way it strips everything down to its bones. Patricia hired her own attorney, a man who was aggressive in the particular way that tells you his client is guilty and knows it. He filed motions. He questioned the characterization of the withdrawn funds. He tried to argue that the transfers were legitimate marital expenditures, that Patricia had been managing household finances and had simply reorganized assets. Margaret let him talk. Then she filed the bank records, the PI's report, and a detailed accounting of every transfer cross-referenced with joint expense records. She brought in a forensic accountant who documented clearly and methodically that none of the withdrawn funds corresponded to any household expense, bill, renovation, or investment either of us had authorized together. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose. She reviewed the documentation. She was not impressed with Patricia's attorney's argument. The house was awarded to me outright on the grounds that Patricia's deception of marital assets constituted bad faith. She was ordered to return the transferred funds, which by then had been traced in their entirety into an investment account Trevor had opened 6 months prior to the first withdrawal. That account had grown slightly. The full amount, plus a penalty, was subject to a civil judgment against both Patricia and Trevor. It took another 4 months and a second court proceeding, but it was recovered. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but it came back. Trevor's attorney apparently advised him to settle rather than contest because a full proceeding would expose conduct that could carry criminal implications. He settled. I am told his attorney was very good at explaining to Trevor just how badly things could go if he didn't. Claire found out in February between the filing and the final hearing. I told her myself. I did not let her find out through Patricia or through Trevor. I drove to Denver on a Thursday 12 hours. I stopped once for gas and once for coffee, and I knocked on her door, and I sat in her kitchen, and I told her everything. I showed her the documents. I watched her face go from confusion to disbelief to something I don't have a word for. A kind of collapse that starts behind the eyes. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "How long did you know?" I told her. She said, "And at Christmas?" I said yes. She was quiet again. Then she put her face in her hands and she cried. Not the happy tears from Christmas morning, the other kind. I put my hand on her back and I sat there with her. Because that's what you do. You sit with people you love when the world falls out from under them. Even when the reason the world fell out is partly because of someone they trusted, someone who slept beside them. She filed for divorce from Trevor 3 weeks later. I did not encourage her to do it. I did not discourage her. It was her life. She was the one who had to figure out what she could live with. I drove back to Asheville on a Sunday night in early April. The dogwoods were starting to bloom along the highway, that particular white that only lasts about a week before it turns. I had the windows down and the radio on low, some country station out of Hendersonville. I was 64 years old, driving home to an empty house. My marriage was over. My daughter's marriage was over. My son-in-law had stolen from me and had been held accountable. But accountability doesn't undo the years or give you back the mornings. I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a while. Then I went inside and I called Vern, and he answered on the second ring the way he always does. And he said, "You doing okay, Howard?" I said I thought so. He said, "Good. That's good." And we sat on the phone together for a while, not saying much, the way old friends can do. The refrigerator hummed. The house settled around me. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, its headlights sweeping across the curtains and then gone. Burns said, "You going to be all right in that house?" I said, "I think so. It's a good house." He laughed a little. "Yeah," he said, "it is. Claire calls me every Sunday now. We talk for a long time. About her job, about what she's reading, about nothing in particular. She is doing better than I would have at her age. She is stronger than she knows. I grow tomatoes in the backyard in the summer. I've started walking every morning, 3 miles, through the neighborhood and down by the river greenway. My blood pressure is better than it's been in a decade. I sleep without waking. I am not telling you this story so you will feel sorry for me. I am not looking for that. I'm telling you because I spent 31 years believing that loyalty was something you could take for granted in the people who were supposed to love you. And what I learned is that loyalty is not a given. It is a daily choice. Some people make it. Some people don't. Byrne made it. He drove 4 hours just to sit with me when the papers were filed. He never once said, "I told you so," even though he'd had reservations about Patricia going back further than either of us admitted at the time. Claire makes it now, I believe, more consciously than before. She told me on the phone a few weeks ago that she thinks she understands people differently now, that she pays attention in a way she didn't used to. I told her that's not the worst thing to come out of all this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Dad, I know. The dogwoods outside are blooming again. Another spring. The yard looks different without someone else in the house, but not worse. Just different, the way a room looks different with the furniture rearranged. You stop expecting things to be where they used to be. You learn the new arrangement. That's where I am, learning the new arrangement. I think that's enough. I keep coming back to a simple fact. The money came back, but the years didn't. That's the part nobody warns you about. You spend your life building something, a marriage, a home, a sense of who the people around you are, and you assume the foundation is solid because it's held this long. 31 years felt like proof of something. It wasn't. It was just time. Time alone doesn't make a person trustworthy. I know that now in a way I didn't at 62. What Patricia and Trevor did had a logic to it, a cause and effect that I've turned over many times since. They didn't stumble into betrayal. They planned it, quietly, patiently, over many months. And what made it possible wasn't just their own dishonesty. It was my assumption that I didn't need to look closely. I managed the investments. She handled the filing. That division of labor felt like trust. What it actually was, I understand now, was a gap I left open, and they walked through it. That's not me blaming myself for their choices. They made their choices, and the court held them accountable for those choices, and that accountability mattered. But I also had to be honest about my own role, not in their wrongdoing, but in my own inattention. Intelligence, real intelligence, isn't just the ability to solve problems when they appear. It's the discipline to stay informed before the problem announces itself. I let years of routine lull me into assuming I knew what was happening in my own financial life. I didn't. I should have. Byrne knew something was off about Patricia years before any of this surfaced. He never pressed it. I never asked. That's something I think about, too. How often we sense things and don't follow the thread because following it would be uncomfortable. Good judgment isn't comfortable. It asks you to look at things you'd rather not see, and then do something with what you find. The hardest thing I did in all of this wasn't filing the papers or hiring Denise or sitting across from Margaret and laying out the evidence. The hardest thing was driving to Denver and telling Claire the truth face to face. I could have let her find out another way. It would have been easier for me in the short term. But she deserved to hear it from her father, clearly and directly, with the documents in front of her so she could see for herself. That required something more than just doing the right thing. It required not flinching from it, staying in the room, watching her face change and not looking away. She's stronger now than she was before. I don't say that to make the betrayal sound like a gift. It wasn't. But there's a kind of strength that only gets built through surviving something you didn't think you could survive, and Claire has that now. So do I think. Byrne drove 4 hours to sit with me while the papers were served. He didn't make a speech about it. He just showed up. That's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not the grand gesture, but the quiet, unglamorous act of being present when it costs you something. I'm 64 years old, and I grow tomatoes, and I walk 3 miles every morning, and I sleep better than I have in years. I lost a marriage and gained a clearer picture of my own life. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. The dogwoods are blooming again. I didn't plant them. They were here when we bought the house. They'll be here after I'm gone. Some things just keep going, indifferent to all the human drama underneath them. There's something steadying in that. I think what I'd want anyone to take from this is that the 3 things that actually held me together through all of it weren't luck or money or even the law. They were knowing what was right and doing it anyway, being willing to think carefully when every instinct said to react, and refusing to quit before it was finished. Those aren't complicated ideas, but they're hard to live, especially when you're sitting in a motel room outside Asheville at 63 years old, looking at photographs that change everything you thought you knew. You hold on, you think clearly, you do the right thing. That's all there is.